Okay, guys, here we go with the first video for Chapter 25, New Worlds, the Americas and Oceania. So we're going to be talking about, kind of the major interactions between Europeans and Native Americans, as well as a little bit with Africans in the Americas. And Oceania refers to the region of the Pacific Ocean, okay, all those islands out there in the Pacific. All right, so first thing we're going to be talking about in this first video is European conquest of the Americas. Now, in Chapter 25, we discussed how European nations first, quote-unquote, discovered the Americas with Columbus and then continued with further voyages across the Atlantic and beyond. Now, much of this chapter deals with the actual conquest of the Americas by various Europeans. We'll begin with the first region to encounter Europeans, which is the Caribbean, okay, so the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean. Columbus's voyages took him to several islands in the Caribbean. So this is where we see the first interaction between Old and New World. The very first Native Americans to encounter Europeans were the Taino. Also known as the Arawak, the Taino settled several islands in the Caribbean in small villages ruled by chiefs. Okay, they lived around areas what today would be Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and so forth. Columbus and the Spaniards who first followed him quickly established a system that became synonymous with Spanish rule in the Americas called the encomienda system. Now, encomiendas were essentially plantations, but it also applied to mineral mines in the Caribbean. The primary motivation for early Spanish exploration and conquest was gold, right? That's what Columbus was looking for. That's what he came back to tell stories to entice more people to go. Unfortunately, though, there really wasn't much gold in the Caribbean. What they did discover, though, was that the Caribbean was well suited for the cultivation of cash crops, especially sugar. The Taino and other natives were forced to labor on the encomienda in exchange for Spanish protection and converting them to Christianity. Or you look at the plan. Spanish settlers would protect, care for, and Christianize Indians, and Indians work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. Sounds okay, still doesn't sound great for the Taino, but the reality is that the Spanish settlers force long labor, don't pay them, fail to protect them, and seize Indian lands, and the reality is that the Indians die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. Okay, so these obviously was a very, very one-sided relationship with the Spanish taking everything and exploiting the Taino for their labor, and the Taino just working themselves to death and dying. Now, as you can imagine, the Taino did not see this as an equal exchange either, and they resisted conscription into forced labor. Taino rebellions and resistance, though, were generally unsuccessful. They were put down very brutally by the Spanish, resulting in widespread death and destruction among the Taino. The Spanish dominated the Taino and other Native Americans through a number of different ways. Trade manipulation, technological superiority with their guns and cannons, but especially disease. And the most dangerous disease they had was smallpox. Now, smallpox was a devastating disease among all Native American populations. Let me just erase that. It was brought by Europeans to all parts of the Americas, and this was not just in the Caribbean. Smallpox was through Central, South, and North America, and it drastically reduced the Native American populations in all of those areas, particularly the Caribbean. As Native workers died from disease, the Spanish began kidnapping neighboring villages, but as the overall populations plummeted, it forced the Spanish to look elsewhere for encomienda workers, namely Africa, but we'll talk more about that later. Let's get into conquest of Mexico and Peru. Now, Spanish interest soon shifted from the Caribbean to the American mainland. The men who traveled to the Americas with a seemingly inexhaustible hunger for resources were known as conquistadors. Here you see their trademark curved brim helmet. And Spanish for conquerors, conquistadors could be ruthless and brutal in their quest for wealth. While they ostensibly traveled for God and country, these were cunning men who were not above getting their hands dirty. The two most important ones were Hernan Cortez and this guy Francisco Pizarro. Let's talk about Cortez first. He landed in Mexico in 1519 and led 450 conquistadors into central Mexico searching for gold. After an initial encounter with the Aztec where Cortez took the Aztec Emperor Montezuma hostage and a conflict that resulted in Montezuma's death, Cortez laid siege to Tenochtitlan, captured the city, and executed the new emperor. Cortez and the Spaniards were able to win through a combination of better technology, right, with their guns. They also made alliances with locals who resented Mexica rule. Remember, the Mexica were the ruling group among the Aztec Empire, and other Native American groups that were subject to the Mexica didn't always like them. Cortez and other conquistadors used that to their advantage by making alliance with these subjected groups. But as I said before, the same thing with the Taino. The most deadly weapon that they had was disease. When disease spread through Tenochtitlan, it decimated the native populations there. It was by far the most effective weapon that the Spanish had. A similar campaign was waged by Francisco Pizarro. Now, Pizarro and his conquistadors conquered the Inca Empire in the Andes, what today would be Peru and Argentina. They took advantage of internal disputes in the Inca government, as well as resentment of the people ruled by the Incas, similar to what Cortez did with the Aztec. But again, most damage was done by smallpox. And by 1540, the Spanish had deposed the last of the Inca rulers and had him executed. All right, so large sections of what today would be Central and South America, basically all along the Pacific coast, are now under Spanish control. Let's talk about these empires a little bit. So eventually the Spanish throne is looking to take direct control over the individual conquests of men like Cortez and Pizarro. And by 1570, Spanish royal authority reigned over much of Central and South America. The Spanish established a very distinct colonial administrative system. Now, under this system, the colonies were administered by viceroys, right? You see the viceroyalty of New Spain. So the viceroys, think of them, they were governors. Okay, they were direct representatives of the crown back in Europe. And because they were extensions of royal authority, viceroys wielded considerable power. In order to keep them in check, Spanish kings used audiencias. Now, these are your different kind of color shades that you have here. All right, you know, there's brown one here, green, blue, and so forth. All right, Audiencia of Santo Domingo, Audiencia of Mexico. Audiencias were royal courts which reviewed the actions of viceroys in order to keep them from gaining too much power. All right, think of it kind of like a checks and balances. While viceroys and the audiences, they wielded a lot of personal power here in the colonies. Spain never established a strong system of government to really keep direct rule over its colonies too much. So because of this, these viceroys and audiencias, even though they were meant to kind of keep each other in check, they each kind of did what they wanted. Transportation and communication were limited both within the colonies and between Spain and the Americas. And so because of this, local provinces were often left largely to govern themselves. All right, so while Spain was claiming most of what we call Latin America, Portugal decided to lay claim to Brazil. Let me take this down. Where is it? All right, so here's Brazil, and Brazil is a big country. It's the largest country in South America, and the entire area here, kind of western Brazil, wasn't initially under Portuguese control. All right, but let's backtrack here a second. Portugal was Spain's main competitor at the beginning of European conquest in the Americas, and this competition got so heated that it had to be settled by the Pope, who acted as an arbitrator for the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, the treaty effectively divided the world between Spain and Portugal. All right, so everything in between here, Portugal. Everything from here to there, Spain. All right, so Portugal did have some colonies in Africa and Asia. We talked about them in some ones. We'll talk about them in other chapters. But Spain gets pretty much all of this. All right, so that's a pretty good deal that Spain gets in South America. But you notice that this area right here is still under Portuguese control. Now, the western portion here would eventually become Brazil, and obviously it would continue to extend inland a little bit more. But that's how Portugal initially gained a foothold in Brazil, and that's why they still speak Portuguese in Brazil to this day. Now, regardless of if we're talking about the Portuguese or the Spanish, they all saw the Americas as a land to exploit rather than settle and colonize. All right, that's important. They went there looking for gold or other minerals. They went there to cultivate cash crops. They weren't going there initially to settle large-scale colonies. However, there were sizable settlements of people from the Iberian Peninsula, right? We're talking about Spain and Portugal, who made the Americas their home. You know, and you still see significant evidence of European conquest, such as the language or Roman Catholicism throughout all of Latin America. Now, let's shift to the north here and talk about North America. So if the Spanish colonies in Central and South America were primarily about exploitation, European colonies in North America were really for resettlement. The Spanish made explorations into North America, you know, states like Florida, Texas, California, but they were all under, and all of these were under Spanish control at one point, but the more lasting settlements in North America were made by the English and the French. Now, with the Spanish and Portuguese already having claimed everything in the Americas south of the equator, England and France sought out the fabled Northwest Passage, right? They thought that there was a way to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific by going north. They never found it because it doesn't exist. This is all ice up here. Okay, this is really, you see how it's north of the Arctic Circle? It's not navigable. So they kind of gave up on the Northwest Passage, but Since trade routes to Asia weren't an option, they decided to concentrate on seeing what they could get out of North America. The French were the first ones to really explore this area down the St. Lawrence River. You can't see it on this map, but here you go. You get a better sense of it. So here's the St. Lawrence River, and they kind of settled down and leads eventually into the Great Lakes, and you see some major settlements like Quebec. All right, that gets settled, that gets founded in 1608, and English colonies of Jamestown and Massachusetts. Right here, you've got the Massachusetts colony. Where's Jamestown? Jamestown down here in Virginia. Okay, they become English colonies in the 1600s, and the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam in 1623 is established, although this would be taken by the English in 1664 and renamed New York. All right, so by the late 1600s, this is what English settlement along the Atlantic coast in North America looked like. Now, life in these colonies was difficult, and some, such as Jamestown, did not survive. We'll talk little bit about the conflict with natives in a minute. But a big difference between the Iberian colonies and the French and English colonies in North America was the way the colonial government was administered. Okay, so we just discussed how Iberian colonies were ruled through a viceroy as a direct extension of royal control. While French and English colonies, they were still subject to the mandates from their parent nations, the colonies themselves were ruled indirectly. English and French colonies were often established by private investors, okay, or by groups such as the Pilgrims coming here for totally separate reasons rather than to be an extension of the English crown. This gave the colonial administrators much more local control than the Spanish viceroys, who had to worry about things like the audiencias looking over their shoulders. Another major point of difference between the two regional colonies was their interaction with Native Americans. Now, the Native American groups the English and the French encountered in North America were very different from those who met the Spanish and Portuguese. North American indigenous groups lacked large-scale civilizations, okay, like the Aztec and the Inca that had large cities and empires. They practiced agriculture, but on a much smaller scale, and often lived semi-nomadic lifestyles, having to move their villages in search of hunting grounds. Here you see a drawing of a typical Algonquin village, right? So there, you can see how these huts can be easily broken down and moved if they had to. Now, the hunting, though, was an aspect that would eventually lead to conflict with Europeans, all right? A very important thing to remember about the North American indigenous groups was that they did not practice private land ownership. Land was to be communally used, and therefore there were huge tracts of lands that were uncultivated. European settlers saw this land as free-for-all. They couldn't always outright take it by force, so they would negotiate treaties to quote-unquote buy it. But since Native Americans didn't truly understand the concept of private land ownership, it was pretty impossible for them to understand what they were getting themselves into. Consequently, they were often swindled out of their land usage, right, with just a couple of trinkets and things given for large tracts of lands. But again, the Native Americans didn't really get the concept of what they were doing. However, they eventually figured out what was going on, and this led to an awful lot of resentment and, of course, conflict, especially when Native American groups felt that European settlement was infringing on their hunting grounds, like we just mentioned. Native American raids on European communities was common, and tensions between the groups would often run high. Europeans were obviously not driven from these lands, and they were successful for the same reasons the Spanish were, namely disease. Smallpox in particular, okay, we're always coming back to that, it ravaged Native American populations, and the settlers from Europe just kept coming. Unfortunately for the Native American groups, they were destined to lose their lands. All right, so we're going to stop it at this one, and the next one we're going to talk about colonial society in the Americas.